The salt-crusted envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, 16 months after her grandfather's funeral, bearing news that would unravel everything Claire Bennett thought she knew about the weathered fisherman who had raised her. Inside was a single rusted key, a faded photograph of a trawler she barely remembered, and a handwritten note in his shaky script: "The Mariana's ghost is yours now. What I hid below deck, I hid for you. Forgive me for the silence." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Claire stood in the cramped kitchen of her Boston apartment, the envelope trembling in her hands as autumn rain streaked the windows. Her daughter Emma, barely 7 years old, sat at the table pushing cereal around her bowl, oblivious to the weight of the moment. The key felt impossibly heavy, like it carried more than just access to an old boat. It carried questions Claire had stopped asking years ago, when her grandfather, Samuel Bennett, had grown distant and hollow-eyed in his final years, speaking less and less until words seemed to cost him too much to spare. She hadn't seen the Mariana's ghost in over a decade. The last time was the summer she turned 19, pregnant and ashamed, showing up at her grandfather's weathered dockhouse in Gloucester with nowhere else to go. He had welcomed her without judgment, asked no questions about Emma's father, and gave them a place to heal. But he never took her out on the boat anymore. Never even mentioned it. The trawler sat abandoned at the far end of the marina, shrouded in tarps and secrets, while Samuel worked odd jobs on other men's vessels, his own fortune seemingly dried up with the cod runs that had sustained his family for 3 generations. "Mom, are we going somewhere?" Emma asked, her voice cutting through Claire's thoughts. Claire looked at her daughter, at the hopeful brightness in her eyes that hadn't yet been dimmed by the realities Claire faced every day. The overdue rent notices. The phone calls from collection agencies. The grinding exhaustion of working double shifts at the seafood processing plant just to keep them fed and housed. Samuel's death had left a void deeper than grief. It had left them vulnerable. "Maybe," Claire answered carefully, tucking the envelope into her jacket pocket. "Maybe we're going home." The bus ride from Boston to Gloucester took 3 hours through gray October landscape, past towns that had once thrived on fishing and now survived on tourist nostalgia. Emma pressed her face against the window, mesmerized by glimpses of ocean between buildings, while Claire studied the photograph that had come with the key. The Mariana's ghost in her glory days, hull painted deep blue, Samuel young and proud at the helm, his wife Margaret beside him with wind-whipped hair and a smile that suggested she knew something the camera didn't. Margaret had been gone for 20 years now, lost to cancer that had eaten through her like rust through steel. Samuel had never remarried, never even seemed to consider it. He had poured everything into the boat and the sea, until even those had abandoned him somehow. Claire had been too young to understand the change when it happened. Only that one season her grandfather had been prosperous and respected, and the next he was taking charity work and avoiding the other fishermen's eyes at the dock. The Gloucester Marina sat in the old industrial quarter where tourism hadn't yet gentrified the waterfront into boutique shops and overpriced restaurants. Here the working boats still outnumbered the pleasure craft, and the air carried the honest stink of fish guts and diesel fuel. Claire had called ahead to the harbor master, an old friend of Samuel's named Vincent Reyes, who had agreed to meet them at the dock. "Claire Bennett," Vincent said as they approached, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifetime of cigarettes and sea air. He was in his 70s now, face carved into deep lines by sun and wind, but his eyes remained sharp as he studied her. "Heard you were coming. Sorry about Samuel. He was a good man, even if he died with too many secrets." "What do you mean, secrets?" Claire asked, shifting Emma's backpack on her shoulder. Vincent glanced at the child, then back at Claire with an expression that suggested careful consideration of what should be said in front of young ears. "The boat's at slip 43, far end of the South Pier. Been sitting there since Samuel passed, untouched. I kept an eye on her like he asked, but I never went aboard. That was his one condition when he prepaid the slip fees for the next 5 years. Nobody boards the Mariana's ghost without his family's permission." 5 years? Claire's stomach tightened. Her grandfather had been living in a studio apartment above the bait shop, taking handout work, claiming poverty. Yet he had paid for 5 years of marina fees in advance. Paid in cash, Vincent added, reading her thoughts. Came in with an envelope thick as my fist, wouldn't say where he got it. That was about 8 months before he died. He paused, studying the horizon where gray clouds gathered over darker water. Claire, your grandfather was mixed up in something during his last years. I don't know what, and I never asked, because Samuel Bennett taught me to fish when my own father wouldn't, and I owed him the respect of silence. But whatever's on that boat, it made him scared. I saw it in his eyes. Emma tugged at Claire's jacket. Mom, I'm cold. Go wait in the harbor office, Claire told her daughter, pressing a few dollars into her small hand. Get yourself a hot chocolate. I'll be right there. Once Emma was out of earshot, Claire turned back to Vincent. Scared of what? I don't know. But about a year before he passed, some men came around asking questions. City types, expensive suits, government badges. They wanted to know about Samuel's fishing routes, his catch records from 30 years back, whether he ever worked salvage jobs. I told them nothing, because Samuel had asked me not to, but they weren't the type to give up easy. Vincent pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. This came for you yesterday, care of the marina. I think they knew you'd be coming. The letter bore a federal seal and the letterhead of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Claire's hands felt numb as she unfolded it, scanning the dense legal language that essentially amounted to a warning: any artifacts, cargo, or materials of historical significance found aboard the vessel known as Mariana's Ghost must be immediately reported to federal authorities under maritime salvage law and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Failure to comply would result in criminal prosecution and seizure of all materials. What the hell did he find out there? Claire whispered. That's what you're about to discover, Vincent replied. But Claire, listen to me. Whatever it is, think carefully before you report it. Federal government gets involved, they'll tie up that boat in legal red tape for years. And from what Samuel said in those last months, whatever he left you was meant to change your life, not complicate it further. Slip 43 sat at the marina's farthest reach, where the working piers gave way to long-term storage and forgotten dreams. The Mariana's Ghost looked smaller than Claire remembered, her hull weathered to the color of old bruises beneath layers of salt and neglect. Tarps covered the deck equipment, held down with lines that had grown green with algae. The name painted on her stern had faded but remained legible, a ghost of better days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire stood on the pier for a long moment, Emma beside her now with a steaming cup clutched in both hands, studying the boat that represented the last tangible connection to her grandfather. The key in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own weight, demanding to be used. Is that really ours? Emma asked, wonder overriding the vessel's shabby appearance. It is now, Claire answered, though the words felt strange in her mouth. She had never owned anything more substantial than a used car, never imagined herself the heir to anything beyond debt and struggle. The boat, decrepit as it was, represented a kind of wealth she didn't quite know how to process. The gangplank creaked under their weight as they boarded, Claire testing each step before allowing Emma to follow. The deck was slippery with accumulated grime and bird droppings, the brass fixtures green with corrosion. But beneath the neglect, Claire could see the bones of a well-built vessel, the kind that had survived 40 years of North Atlantic storms because it had been crafted with pride and maintained with love. The wheelhouse door hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside, everything remained as if Samuel had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. His oilskin jacket still hung on its hook. His coffee mug sat on the chart table, dried residue dark at the bottom. Navigation maps of the Georges Bank and Stellwagen Bank covered the walls, some marked with notations in Samuel's precise handwriting, others bearing water stains that had rendered them illegible. But it was the chart table itself that drew Claire's attention. The key from the envelope didn't fit the wheelhouse door or the cabin below. It was too small, too specifically crafted. She ran her hands along the underside of the table, searching by touch what her eyes couldn't immediately see. Her fingers found it in the aft corner, a small keyhole almost invisible in the shadowed wood. The key turned with a click that sounded too loud in the confined space. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing a waterproof case wrapped in layers of sealed plastic. Inside the case, protected from moisture and time, was a leather journal, a collection of photographs bound with rubber bands, and a small metal cylinder about the size of a thermos. Emma pressed close, trying to see. "What is it, Mom?" Claire lifted the journal carefully, its leather cover soft with age and handling. The first page bore a date from 32 years ago, written in Samuel's steady hand, August 14th, "Found the wreck today. God forgive me for what I'm about to do." Her grandfather's confession, whatever it was, had been waiting in this drawer for 3 decades. Claire's throat tightened as she flipped through pages dense with coordinates, sketches of what appeared to be a ship's hull, and increasingly frantic entries about secrecy and danger and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. One entry, dated 6 months after the first, made Claire's blood run cold. "They're watching the marina. The men in the dark sedan have been here 3 times this week. If they knew what I pulled from that wreck, if they knew what I've kept hidden in the Mariana's bilge all these months, they'd arrest me or worse. But I can't bring myself to destroy it. It's too important. Someday Margaret's granddaughter will need what I've saved. Someday this will matter more than my cowardice." Margaret's granddaughter. Claire had never known her grandmother, who had died when Claire's own mother was still young. But Samuel had known. Had planned for this moment across decades of silence. "Mom, there's something else," Emma said, pointing to the back of the drawer where a folded document had been wedged behind the case. Claire pulled it free, recognizing immediately the heavy paper and official seals of a legal deed. It took her several moments to process what she was reading. The Mariana's ghost wasn't just a boat. It was the key to a modest commercial fishing license, a slip lease with equity that had accumulated over 40 years, and most impossibly, a small waterfront property in Gloucester's historic district that Samuel had apparently purchased in 1987 and held in trust for his descendants. The property was worth at least $500,000 according to the most recent tax assessment included in the papers. Claire sat down hard on the wheelhouse bench, the documents spilling across her lap. Her grandfather hadn't been poor. He had deliberately lived poor, working other men's boats and renting cheap rooms, while quietly accumulating assets in her name. But why? What had driven him to such elaborate deception? The answer lay in the metal cylinder. Claire unscrewed its cap with hands that shook slightly, revealing a rolled document sealed in plastic. She extracted it carefully, unrolling what appeared to be a sonar image, the kind produced by professional maritime survey equipment. The image showed the unmistakable outline of a ship's hull on the ocean floor, surrounded by scattered debris. Written in the margin in Samuel's handwriting, SS Belmont, sunk 1943, approximate depth 240 feet, coordinates 42 degrees 23 minutes north, 70 degrees 47 minutes west. Beside the coordinates was a notation that made Claire's breath catch: confirmed cargo manifest, gold bullion, U.S. Treasury bonds, classified military documents. Salvage rights contested. Federal investigation ongoing as of 1992. Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, studying the sonar image with a child's uncomplicated curiosity. "Did Grandpa find treasure?" "I think he did," Claire answered slowly, her mind racing through implications she barely understood. "And I think he's been protecting it all these years, waiting for the right time to bring it into the light." But as she sat in the wheelhouse of her inherited boat, surrounded by her grandfather's secrets and watching storm clouds gather over Gloucester Harbor, Claire realized with growing certainty that the right time might have already passed. The federal letter. The men who had questioned Vincent. The elaborate preparations Samuel had made to ensure the Mariana's ghost remained undisturbed. Someone else was looking for what Samuel had found. And now that Claire had claimed her inheritance, she had painted a target on her own back without even understanding what she was protecting. The boat creaked beneath them as the rising tide shifted its weight against the dock lines. Somewhere in the harbor a foghorn sounded its melancholy warning. Claire gathered the documents, the journal, and the sonar image, replacing them carefully in their waterproof case. Whatever her grandfather had salvaged from the SS Belmont, whatever he had kept hidden in the Mariana's bilge for 3 decades, it was her responsibility now. She thought of the overdue rent notices back in Boston, the collection calls she had been avoiding, the grinding poverty that had defined her adult life. Samuel had left her a way out, but the price of that escape was written in his journal's frantic entries and the federal government's threatening letters. "Are we going to live on the boat?" Emma asked, her voice bright with the adventure of it all. Claire looked at her daughter, at the innocence that hadn't yet been taught to fear the complications of inherited secrets. "Maybe," she said, echoing the same uncertain promise she had made that morning in their Boston apartment. "But first, we need to find out what Grandpa was so afraid of. And why he thought it was worth hiding for so long." As they prepared to leave the wheelhouse, Claire noticed something she had missed before. Scratched into the wood beside the hidden drawer, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, were 3 words in Samuel's careful hand: "Trust no one." The harbormaster's office smelled of old coffee and diesel fumes, its walls covered with faded maritime charts and photographs of boats that no longer existed. Vincent Reyes sat behind a desk buried in paperwork, his weathered hands wrapped around a chipped mug as Claire spread Samuel's documents across the only clear space available. Emma had fallen asleep on a cracked vinyl couch in the corner, exhausted from the day's revelations and the rocking motion of the harbor beneath them. "Jesus Christ," Vincent breathed, studying the sonar image of the SS Belmont. "Samuel actually found it. We all thought he was chasing ghost stories." Claire leaned forward, her voice low to avoid waking Emma. "What do you know about this ship?" Vincent pulled reading glasses from his shirt pocket, peering at the coordinates and manifest notations. The Belmont was a cargo vessel that went down in 1943 during a nor'easter. Official story was she was carrying manufacturing equipment for the war effort, nothing particularly valuable. But there were always rumors among the old-timers, stories about treasury gold being moved up the coast away from potential U-boat activity, about classified documents that couldn't risk air transport. He looked up at Claire, his expression grave. If Samuel found proof that those rumors were true, he'd have opened a hornet's nest that would never close. "But salvage rights," Claire said, grasping at the legal concept she barely understood. "If he discovered the wreck, doesn't that give him claim to whatever was aboard?" "Not when the federal government's involved. Not when it's their gold, their bonds, their secrets." Vincent tapped the journal where Samuel had written about contested salvage rights. "Your grandfather would have known that the moment he pulled anything off that wreck, he was committing a federal crime. But he did it anyway, which means whatever he found was important enough to risk everything." Claire thought of Samuel in his final years, the hollow look in his eyes, the way he had stopped talking about the sea as if it had betrayed him somehow. He had something in the boat's bilge. He wrote about it in the journal. "Then that's where we start," Vincent said, pushing back from his desk with the groan of old joints protesting. "But Claire, you need to understand what you're walking into. Those federal agents who came around weren't just making routine inquiries. They had specific information, probably from someone who knew what Samuel had done. This secret has been eating at someone for 30 years, and now that Samuel's gone, they'll be circling closer." The walk back to the Mariana's ghost felt different now, weighted with purpose and danger. The October night had turned cold, wind coming off the water with the bite of early winter. Claire carried Emma piggyback while Vincent led the way with a heavy-duty flashlight that cut through the darkness gathering over the marina. At slip 43, Vincent hesitated before boarding. "Your grandfather made me promise something, about 6 months before he died. He made me swear that if anyone came asking about the Mariana, anyone official, I would stall them as long as possible and make sure you knew they were coming." He turned to face Claire fully. "Those agents will be back. The federal letter you received wasn't just a warning, it was confirmation that they're actively investigating. You probably have days, maybe less, before they show up with a warrant to search this vessel." Claire's arms tightened around Emma's sleeping weight. "Then we don't have time to waste." The bilge access was through a hatch in the forward cabin, beneath what had once been Samuel's sleeping berth. The cabin itself was a time capsule of her grandfather's life at sea, personal belongings exactly as he had left them, down to the reading glasses folded on a stack of fishing magazines from 2019. Claire laid Emma gently on the berth, covering her with a musty blanket, before turning her attention to the hatch. It was sealed with layers of marine caulk that had hardened over years, requiring Vincent's pry bar to crack loose. The smell that emerged when the hatch finally opened was salt and rust and something older, the scent of secrets kept in darkness for too long. Vincent's flashlight beam cut into the bilge's depths, illuminating standing water and the curved ribs of the hull. "There," Vincent said, directing the light to the starboard side where something large and rectangular sat wrapped in multiple layers of heavy plastic and secured with marine rope to the hull's framework. "That's not standard bilge equipment." Getting the package up through the narrow hatch took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, both of them soaked with bilge water and breathing hard by the time they wrestled it into the cabin. The plastic wrapping was industrial grade, heat-sealed and reinforced with duct tape that had somehow maintained its adhesion through decades of dampness and temperature fluctuation. Samuel had been nothing if not thorough in his preservation efforts. Claire's hands shook as she cut through the layers with Vincent's knife, each breach releasing stale air that hadn't circulated since the package was sealed. The final layer revealed a military-grade waterproof case, dented and scarred with age but intact. Its locks had long since corroded, yielding easily to Vincent's pry bar. Inside, packed in deteriorating foam, were 3 distinct items. The first was a metal strongbox approximately the size of a large shoebox, surprisingly heavy for its dimensions. The second was a leather portfolio bulging with documents. The third was a small wooden chest, ornately carved with maritime motifs, its brass fittings green with verdigris but still functional. Vincent whistled low. "Open the strongbox first." The lid resisted, then gave way with a shriek of corroded metal. Inside, nestled in rotted velvet, were 16 gold bars, each stamped with U.S. Treasury marks and serial numbers. Even in the dim cabin light, they gleamed with an inner fire that made Claire's breath catch. She had never seen real gold before, never understood how something could be simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. "How much?" she whispered. Vincent lifted one bar carefully, testing its weight. "Standard gold bar is 400 troy ounces. At current market prices, you're looking at close to $750,000 per bar." He did the math silently. $12 million, give or take. The number was incomprehensible. Claire sat back hard on the cabin sole, her mind refusing to process the reality of what lay before her. $12 million had been sitting in her grandfather's bilge while he worked for minimum wage gutting fish on other men's boats. Why didn't he use it, she asked, though the question sounded foolish even to her own ears. Why live in poverty when he had this? Because the moment he tried to sell even one bar, the federal government would have been on him like sharks on blood. Vincent carefully replaced the gold. "These serial numbers are recorded somewhere, probably in a Treasury Department vault. Try to move this gold through any legitimate channel and you'd have agents at your door before the transaction cleared." The leather portfolio contained documents that made the gold seem almost simple by comparison. Shipping manifests for the SS Belmont detailing cargo that officially didn't exist. Correspondence between Treasury officials and military commanders discussing the covert movement of gold reserves. Most damning of all, a classified memorandum dated 1943 acknowledging that the Belmont's loss included not just gold but sensitive intelligence documents related to ongoing military operations. "This is why they've been looking," Claire said, spreading the documents across Samuel's berth beside Emma's sleeping form. "It's not just about the gold. These documents prove the government lied about what was on that ship. They prove there was a cover-up." Vincent studied the memorandum with narrowed eyes. "And they prove your grandfather committed salvage theft on a protected wreck site. Claire, this isn't buried treasure with a heartwarming story. This is evidence of a federal crime, and you're now in possession of the proceeds." The wooden chest contained something more personal and somehow more troubling than either gold or government secrets. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were personal effects clearly taken from the Belmont's crew. A ship captain's logbook, water-damaged but legible. Wedding rings and pocket watches engraved with names. Letters from sweethearts and wives, their ink faded but words still clear across 80 years. Photographs of men in uniform, young and confident in that moment before the sea claimed them. Claire lifted a photograph gently, studying the face of a sailor who couldn't have been more than 20. On the back, written in a woman's careful script, "My darling Robert, come home safe to me. All my love, Dorothy." "They never recovered the bodies," Vincent said quietly. "The Belmont went down in deep water during a storm. The official investigation concluded the entire crew was lost, but they couldn't mount a recovery operation in wartime. These men have been down there for 80 years. Claire felt tears sting her eyes, not for her own situation but for Dorothy, who had written those hopeful words and then spent a lifetime wondering if her Robert had suffered, if he had thought of her in those final moments. For all the families who had never gotten closure, never been able to lay their loved ones to rest properly. "Samuel took these because he knew," she said, understanding flooding through her. "He knew that someday someone would need to prove the wreck existed, that real people died there. This isn't just evidence of salvage, it's evidence that the government abandoned these men and then lied about what they were carrying." A sound from the dock made them both freeze. Footsteps, measured and purposeful, approaching slip 43. Vincent killed the flashlight immediately, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by faint moonlight through the porthole. Claire gathered the documents quickly, her heart hammering as the footsteps grew closer. U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service, a man's voice called from the dock. "We're looking for Claire Bennett. We know you're aboard the vessel." Vincent put a hand on Claire's arm, his grip firm. "Don't answer," he breathed. "They need a warrant to board without your permission." "Ms. Bennett," the voice continued, "we're not here to arrest you. We just want to talk about materials that may have come into your possession following Samuel Bennett's death. Materials that belong to the federal government and need to be returned for proper archival and analysis." Claire's mind raced. They couldn't know about the gold, not specifically. The letter had been a fishing expedition, a way to gauge her response and see if she revealed knowledge of the salvage. But if they had enough evidence to show up at the boat in the middle of the night, someone had talked. Someone knew what Samuel had done and had finally decided to break their silence. "This is Special Agent Marcus Webb," the voice said, and Claire heard patience wearing thin beneath professional courtesy. "I have authority to detain you for questioning regarding possible violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and federal salvage law. But I'd prefer to do this the easy way, with voluntary cooperation and minimal disruption to your life." Emma stirred on the berth, her eyes opening in confusion and fear at the strange voices. Claire pulled her daughter close, making soothing sounds while her mind calculated impossible odds. The gold was too heavy to move quickly. The documents were damning regardless of how she explained them. And running would only confirm guilt she hadn't even fully processed yet. "What do I do?" she whispered to Vincent. The old harbormaster's face was grim in the darkness. "Your grandfather trusted you with this for a reason. He could have destroyed it all, could have dumped it back in the ocean or sold it through black market channels. But he kept it, documented everything, and left it specifically for you." He pressed something into her hand, small and hard. "Backdoor key to my office. There's a waterproof bag under my desk. Take the most important documents, the ones that prove the cover-up, and hide them somewhere these agents won't think to look. The gold stays here, you can't move it without them seeing. But the truth, that's what Samuel really wanted preserved." "Ms. Bennett, we're coming aboard," Agent Webb announced. "You have 30 seconds to make yourself known or we'll assume the vessel is abandoned and conduct a safety inspection." Vincent was already moving, climbing up through the forward hatch onto the deck with the heavy grace of a man who had spent his life on boats. Claire heard his voice raised in protest, buying her precious seconds. She grabbed the leather portfolio and the ship captain's logbook, shoving them into her jacket along with several of the most damning government documents. The rest, including the gold and the personal effects, she covered hastily with the blankets on Samuel's berth. "Mom, what's happening?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. "We're going to play a game," Claire said, forcing calm into her voice. "We're going to be very quiet and very still, and let the adults talk. Can you do that for me? Emma nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. Claire pulled her daughter close, both of them sitting on the covered evidence as footsteps thudded on the deck above. She heard Vincent's voice raised in indignation, something about proper procedure and marina rules, but the protest was overridden by official authority that brooked no argument. Agent Marcus Webb ducked through the cabin entrance, his silhouette blocking the doorway. He was younger than Claire expected, maybe 40, with the lean build and careful movements of someone trained to assess threats quickly. Behind him, a second agent, a woman with severe features and cold eyes, scanned the cabin with professional thoroughness. "Ms. Bennett," Webb said, his tone shifting to something almost sympathetic now that he could see Claire and Emma huddled on the berth. "I'm sorry to intrude at this hour. But we have reason to believe your grandfather salvaged materials from a protected wreck site, materials that legally belong to the U.S. government. We're not here to punish anyone. We just want to recover what was taken and close a case that's been open for far too long." "I don't know what you're talking about," Claire said, and was surprised to find her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "My grandfather left me an old fishing boat. That's all." The female agent, whose badge identified her as Special Agent Karen Price, smiled without warmth. "Ms. Bennett, we've been investigating the SS Belmont salvage for 15 years. We know your grandfather made repeated dives to the wreck site between 1991 and 1993. We know he brought materials aboard this vessel. And we know he kept something hidden, something important enough that he lived in poverty rather than risk exposing what he'd found." She stepped closer, her gaze sharp. "What we don't know is where he hid it. But we will find it, with or without your cooperation." Claire felt Emma trembling against her side. She thought of Samuel, working in silence for 30 years to protect whatever truth lay buried with the Belmont's crew. She thought of Dorothy's letter to Robert, of all the families who had never gotten answers about what really happened to their loved ones. And she thought of the documents pressed against her ribs beneath her jacket, proof of lies that had outlived the liars who told them. "Then I guess you'll have to search," she said quietly. "Because I can't help you find something I don't know exists." Agent Webb studied her for a long moment, and Claire saw the exact instant he decided she was lying. His expression shifted from sympathetic to calculating, the mask of courtesy slipping to reveal the hunter beneath. "Agent Price, document everything," he ordered. "I want this vessel photographed, every compartment cataloged, every possible hiding place identified. If Samuel Bennett hid something on this boat, we're going to find it." He turned back to Claire. "You and your daughter will need to come with us for formal questioning. This is no longer a voluntary conversation." Vincent's voice erupted from the deck above. "Like hell they will. You can't remove them from the vessel without charging them with something specific. I know my maritime law, Webb, and I know you're overstepping your authority." "Then I'll charge her with obstruction," Webb shot back, his patience finally exhausted. "Harboring government property, interfering with a federal investigation, take your pick. This boat is now a crime scene and everyone aboard is a material witness at minimum." Claire stood slowly, Emma clinging to her side. Through the cabin porthole, she could see lights coming on in other boats, marina residents woken by the commotion and gathering to watch the drama unfold. Among them, she recognized faces from her childhood, people who had known Samuel, who had respected him even in his diminished final years. They were watching, and whatever happened next would become part of Gloucester's collective memory, another story told in bars and dock houses about the sea's ability to keep secrets until the exact wrong moment. "I want a lawyer," Claire said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth but necessary. "And I want Vincent Reyes present for any questioning. He was my grandfather's friend and he knows more about this boat than I do." Agent Price laughed, a sound without humor. "You think a harbor master and whatever public defender you get assigned will stand between you and federal prosecution? Ms. Bennett, you're in possession of stolen government property worth millions of dollars. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate and possibly avoid prison time, or obstruct and guarantee that your daughter grows up visiting you through reinforced glass." The threat hung in the cabin's close air, stark and terrifying. Emma began to cry, quiet sobs that broke Claire's heart more than any federal charge possibly could. She thought of her apartment in Boston, the overdue rent and collection calls that had seemed like insurmountable problems just that morning. How innocent those struggles seemed now, compared to the weight of secrets that could destroy everything she had left. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. Anger, hot and righteous, at the casual way these agents threatened her child. Determination, inherited from a grandfather who had lived in poverty rather than betray whatever principle had kept him silent. And a dawning understanding that Samuel hadn't left her gold or documents or even truth, not really. He had left her a choice, the same choice he had faced 30 years ago when he pulled that strongbox from the Belmont's wreckage. Some things, Samuel had decided, were worth more than safety. Some truths needed to be preserved even at terrible cost. And some legacies were measured not in comfort or security, but in the courage to protect what mattered when everyone else was willing to let it sink back into darkness. "Then I guess we're going to need that lawyer," Claire said, and heard her grandfather's stubborn pride in her own voice. "Because I'm not telling you anything until I understand exactly what you think my rights are in this situation. And neither is anyone else on this boat." The holding cell at the Coast Guard station smelled of industrial cleaner and salt air filtering through a single barred window. Claire sat on the metal bench with Emma curled against her side, both of them wrapped in rough blankets someone had provided after the cold night aboard the Mariana's Ghost. It was nearly dawn, gray light bleeding into the small room, and Claire hadn't slept at all, her mind cycling through the same impossible calculations of what came next. Vincent had been released hours ago after minimal questioning, his status as a cooperative witness and local fixture providing protections Claire didn't have. Before leaving, he had pressed his business card into her hand with a lawyer's number written on the back in his cramped handwriting. "Thomas Brennan," he had whispered. "Former Coast Guard himself, knows maritime law better than anyone in Massachusetts. Tell him I sent you and that it's about the Belmont. He'll understand." Now, as footsteps approached in the corridor outside, Claire felt Emma stir against her. "Are we in trouble?" her daughter asked, the question carrying a weight no 7-year-old should have to bear. "I don't know yet," Claire answered honestly, because lies seemed pointless now, with everything exposed and nothing left to hide behind except the truth Samuel had protected for so long. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." The door opened to reveal not Agent Webb or Price, but a woman in her 60s wearing civilian clothes and an expression of professional sympathy that immediately set Claire on edge. She carried a briefcase worn soft with use and moved with the deliberate care of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms like this, managing other people's disasters. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Sarah Kowalski, federal public defender assigned to your case." She settled onto the bench opposite them, opening her briefcase to reveal file folders already thick with documentation. "I've spent the past 3 hours reviewing the circumstances of your detention and the alleged violations. We need to talk about your options, and we need to do it quickly, because the U.S. Attorney's Office is convening at 9 a.m. to determine formal charges." Claire's throat tightened. "What kind of charges?" Kowalski's expression remained neutral, the practiced calm of someone who delivered bad news so regularly it had become routine. "Worst-case scenario, they charge you with possession of stolen government property, violation of archaeological protection statutes, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Combined, you're looking at potential prison time of 5 to 8 years, significant fines, and permanent forfeiture of all salvaged materials plus any assets deemed to have been acquired through illegal salvage proceeds." Emma whimpered, and Claire pulled her closer, feeling her own heart hammering against her ribs. "And best case? They accept that you had no knowledge of the salvage until after your grandfather's death, that you were simply claiming an inheritance without understanding its implications. In that scenario, they offer immunity in exchange for full cooperation, voluntary surrender of all materials, and a signed statement detailing everything Samuel told you or left in documentation about the Belmont wreck." Kowalski paused. "The problem is, your refusal to cooperate last night doesn't support the innocent heir narrative. It suggests you knew exactly what you were protecting and chose obstruction over compliance." Claire thought of the documents pressed against her ribs beneath her jacket, still hidden, still potentially devastating to the government's version of events. If she surrendered them now, they would disappear into classification protocols, and the Belmont's families would never know the truth their loved ones died protecting. But if she kept them hidden, if she continued Samuel's 3-decade defiance of federal authority, she would almost certainly go to prison, and Emma would enter the foster system, alone and abandoned just as Claire had feared since the moment she realized she was pregnant with no support and no future. "What would you advise?" Claire asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Lawyers dealt in pragmatism, in minimizing damage rather than achieving justice. Kowalski studied her for a long moment. "Legally, I advise full cooperation. Give them everything, tell them everything, and hope they see you as a victim of circumstance rather than an active participant in salvage theft." She closed her briefcase with a decisive click. "But Ms. Bennett, I've been doing this job for 32 years. I've represented fishermen and boat captains and people whose entire lives revolve around the sea's economy and its secrets. And I can tell you from experience that there's legal advice and there's human advice, and they don't always align." "What's the human advice?" Claire asked, hearing something shift in the attorney's tone, a hint of sympathy breaking through professional detachment. "That your grandfather spent 3 decades protecting something he believed mattered more than his own freedom or comfort. That he lived in poverty and died with secrets because he thought someday someone would be brave enough or stubborn enough to make those secrets mean something." Kowalski leaned forward. "The question you need to answer is whether you're that person, and whether what he protected is worth risking your daughter's stability to bring into the light." The words hung in the stale air of the holding cell, a challenge and an absolution wrapped together. Claire looked down at Emma, at the trust in her daughter's eyes despite everything that had happened, and felt the weight of choices that would define not just their immediate future but the story they would tell themselves for the rest of their lives. Before she could answer, the door opened again, this time revealing Thomas Brennan, the attorney Vincent had recommended. He was tall and weathered, somewhere in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent significant time at sea before trading it for law books. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct as he assessed Claire with the quick efficiency of a man accustomed to reading people under pressure. "Vincent called me at 4 a.m., he said without preamble. Told me Samuel Bennett's granddaughter was sitting in a holding cell with evidence that could rewrite 80 years of maritime history, and that federal agents were about to bury it all under national security protocols. So I made some calls of my own." He pulled a chair over, settling in with the casual confidence of someone who knew he held cards the other side hadn't seen yet. "Tell me about the documents you're hiding, Ms. Bennett. And don't bother denying it, because I can see them making a rectangular outline beneath your jacket, and Sarah here is too good at her job to have missed it." Claire's hand moved instinctively to her ribs, protective of the papers that suddenly felt like they were burning through fabric and skin. They're classified government documents from 1943. Correspondence proving the Belmont was carrying gold and treasury bonds, and that officials deliberately lied about the cargo to avoid panic during wartime. She hesitated, then added, "And there's a memorandum acknowledging the loss of military intelligence documents that were never supposed to be on a civilian vessel in the first place." Brennan's expression sharpened. "That's what they're really afraid of. Not the gold, that's just money and the government has plenty of that. But intelligence documents that were improperly transported and lost due to official negligence, that's a scandal that touches military brass and potentially implicates long-dead decision-makers whose reputations are still protected by their descendants." He turned to Kowalski. "Sarah, your client needs to make a phone call before the U.S. attorney convenes. I'm invoking maritime whistleblower protections under the Lloyd La Follette Act as amended." Kowalski's eyebrows rose. "That's a creative interpretation of whistleblower statute. Not sure it applies to historical documentation of events 80 years old. It applies if the documents reveal ongoing governmental misconduct, specifically the continued classification of materials whose secrecy serves no national security purpose but does protect institutional reputation." Brennan was already pulling his phone out. "I have contacts at the New York Times and Washington Post who would be very interested in authenticated documents proving the federal government has been lying about the Belmont for 8 decades. Once those documents are in journalistic hands with source protection, prosecuting Ms. Bennett becomes politically toxic." Claire felt something shift in her chest, hope mixed with terror at the escalation Brennan was proposing. You want me to leak classified documents to the press? I want you to exercise your rights as a citizen who has come into possession of historical information the public has a right to know. There's precedent for this, from the Pentagon Papers forward. Governments don't get to classify their own embarrassments indefinitely just because revelation would be inconvenient. He looked at her directly. But Ms. Bennett, understand what you're choosing. This path doesn't lead to quiet resolution and immunity deals. It leads to years of legal warfare, media attention, and becoming the face of a fight against federal overreach in maritime archaeology. You'll be attacked, investigated, and probably bankrupted by legal fees even if we ultimately win. Emma stirred against Claire's side. Mom, what's he saying? Claire smoothed her daughter's hair, buying herself a moment to think through implications that seemed to multiply faster than she could track them. Samuel had hidden his discovery for 30 years because he understood the cost of revelation. But he had also preserved it, documented it meticulously, and left it specifically for Claire to find. That wasn't the action of a man who wanted his secrets buried forever. That was the action of a man who believed someday the cost would be worth paying. He's saying we have a choice, Claire told Emma, speaking as much to herself as to her daughter. We can give up everything Grandpa Samuel protected and go home safe but empty-handed. Or we can fight to make sure what he found matters, that the families of those sailors finally know the truth, even if fighting means our life gets a lot harder for a while. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious in a way that made Claire's heart ache. Then she asked, "What would Grandpa Samuel want us to do?" The question cut through all of Claire's complex calculations, reducing everything to simple clarity. Samuel had already answered, with 30 years of poverty and silence and meticulous documentation. He had chosen truth over comfort, principle over safety, and had trusted that someday someone in his bloodline would be strong enough to finish what he started. He'd want us to fight, Claire said, and felt the decision settle into her bones with a finality that was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. She looked at Brennan. Make your phone calls. I'll give you copies of the documents, but I keep the originals secured somewhere the government can't disappear them if they decide legal warfare isn't worth the publicity. Brennan smiled, and it was the expression of a man who had been hoping for exactly that answer. Now we're playing the game properly. Sarah, your client is no longer seeking immunity or cooperation deals. She's asserting her rights under maritime salvage law to document and preserve historical materials found in the course of legitimate inheritance. The government can challenge that in court, but they'll have to do it publicly, with journalists watching every filing. The transformation that followed happened with a speed that left Claire breathless. Brennan made his calls while Kowalski drafted legal filings asserting Claire's rights and challenging the validity of her detention. By 8 a.m., when Agent Webb arrived expecting a frightened woman ready to cooperate, he instead found attorneys armed with writs and a media strategy that would turn the case into a public spectacle if the government pushed forward with prosecution. "This is a mistake," Webb said, his professional composure cracking to reveal frustration beneath. "Ms. Bennett, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. We're not the enemy here. We're just trying to recover government property and close a case that should have been resolved decades ago." By prosecuting the granddaughter of the man who documented your cover-up, Brennan countered smoothly. By threatening a single mother with prison time if she doesn't help you bury evidence that the federal government lied about what was on the Belmont. Agent Webb, you're a good investigator, which means you know how this looks to anyone outside the institutional bubble. You're not recovering stolen property, you're protecting bureaucratic reputation at the expense of historical truth. Webb's jaw tightened. The documents are classified for reasons of national security. The documents are classified because they're embarrassing, Brennan shot back. There's a difference, and federal courts have been recognizing that difference with increasing frequency. You can take this to trial if you want, but every day of that trial will generate headlines about government secrecy and maritime cover-ups. Is that really the outcome your superiors want? The standoff lasted another hour, federal agents and attorneys trading legal threats and procedural challenges while Claire sat with Emma in a conference room, feeling increasingly like a spectator in her own life. But as mid-morning sun slanted through the windows, Casting the room in harsh light that showed every exhausted face, Agent Price finally spoke the words that changed everything. "We need to call Washington," she said to Webb, her expression resigned. "This is above our authorization level. If Bennett's attorney is serious about going public, DOJ needs to make the call on how to proceed." The waiting that followed was excruciating. Claire and Emma were moved to a more comfortable room, provided with breakfast neither of them could stomach, and left alone while lawyers and federal officials engaged in communications Claire could only imagine. Vincent appeared at some point, having talked his way past security with the kind of persistent stubbornness that seemed to be a regional trait among Gloucester fishermen. He brought coffee for Claire and a stuffed seal for Emma, practical kindness that made Claire want to weep with gratitude. "You're doing the right thing," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her while Emma dozed on a couch in the corner. "Samuel would be proud. Hell, he is proud, wherever old fishermen's souls go when they finally come in from the sea." "I don't feel brave," Claire admitted. "I feel terrified and like I'm gambling with my daughter's future on the hope that documents from 1943 actually matter to anyone in 2024. They matter to the families," Vincent reminded her. "To James Morrison and the others who never got straight answers about how their fathers died and what they died protecting. That's not abstract principle, Claire. That's real people whose grief deserves truth, even 80 years late." By early afternoon, the call came from Washington. Claire was summoned back to the conference room where Brennan and Kowalski waited with expressions that gave nothing away. Agent Webb sat across the table, his earlier hostility replaced by something more complex, a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "The Department of Justice has reviewed the situation," he began formally. "In light of the historical significance of the materials involved and the public interest in transparency regarding World War II-era maritime incidents, they've decided to pursue an alternative resolution." He slid a document across the table. "This is an offer of settlement. No criminal charges against you or your grandfather's estate. You retain the salvaged materials except the gold bars, which remain government property but will be held in trust with proceeds designated for a memorial fund in honor of the Belmont's crew. The classified documents will be reviewed for declassification, with redacted versions released to the public within 6 months. And you agree to donate Samuel's documentation and personal effects related to the Belmont discovery to the Smithsonian Institution for Historical Preservation and Public Education." Claire read through the settlement terms slowly, Brennan leaning over her shoulder to point out key clauses and potential implications. It wasn't everything she had hoped for. The gold would disappear into government vaults regardless of what promises were made. But it was more than she had dared imagine that morning in the holding cell, believing she would have to choose between prison and betraying Samuel's legacy. "What about the memorial?" she asked. "What guarantee do I have that the fund will actually be used to honor those men, and not just absorbed into some bureaucratic budget?" Webb's expression softened slightly. "I know this is hard to believe, but not everyone in the federal government is interested in covering up history. Some of us have spent careers trying to bring closure to families who lost loved ones in wartime. The memorial fund will be administered by the National Park Service with full public accounting. And Ms. Bennett, for what it's worth, your grandfather's documentation is some of the best maritime archaeology work I've seen from a civilian. If he had come forward in 1991 instead of hiding his discovery, he could have worked with us instead of against us." "He didn't trust you," Claire said simply. "And given how hard you tried to suppress this even after his death, I'd say his instincts were right." Webb didn't argue the point. Instead he stood, offering his hand across the table. "I hope you find peace with whatever you decide, Ms. Bennett. And I hope those documents bring the closure to the Belmont families that they deserve. Even if it took 80 years and a stubborn fisherman's granddaughter to make it happen." The settlement was signed by late afternoon, witnessed and notarized with legal solemnity that seemed absurd given that they were essentially agreeing the government would stop trying to imprison Claire in exchange for her agreeing to stop threatening to embarrass them publicly. But beneath the legal formality, something real had shifted. The Belmont story would finally be told, the gold would fund a memorial, and Samuel's decades of secret keeping would be transformed from crime into contribution to historical knowledge. Walking out of the Coast Guard station into autumn dusk, Emma's hand in hers and Vincent at her side, Claire felt exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The past 48 hours had stripped away every assumption she'd held about her life's trajectory, revealing possibilities she had never imagined and responsibilities she had never sought. The $2 million from the settlement wouldn't arrive for months, tied up in bureaucratic processing and fund establishment. The Mariana's ghost still needed extensive restoration. The waterfront property still sat empty, waiting for purpose. Everything remained uncertain except one fundamental truth: she was Samuel Bennett's granddaughter, and that meant something now in ways it never had before. What now? Vincent asked as they stood in the parking lot, the harbor visible beyond buildings, water catching the last light of day. Claire looked at Emma, at the resilience in her young daughter's eyes despite everything they'd been through. She thought of Samuel working alone in that hidden chamber, documenting crimes and preserving truth because he believed someday it would matter. And she thought of all the families who would finally learn what happened to their loved ones, who would finally be able to grieve with full knowledge instead of perpetual uncertainty. Now we go back to the boat, she said, feeling the rightness of the decision as she spoke it. We finish the restoration properly, not as a crime scene but as a memorial to the man who loved her. And then we figure out what kind of life we can build here, in Gloucester, where the sea remembers everything and forgives nothing, but sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and brave enough, gives back what it took. Vincent nodded approval. Samuel would like that. He always said the Mariana's ghost had more voyages in her, that she'd sail again when the time was right. Looks like the time is now, and you're the captain he was waiting for. The harbor at dusk smelled of salt and fish and diesel, the working scent of a place that had sustained families for generations through its brutal generosity. Claire stood at the Mariana's ghost's slip as night settled over Gloucester, Emma already aboard exploring the restored sections with fearless curiosity, and felt the weight of inheritance settle into something bearable. Not easy, never easy, but bearable because it was shared across time with a grandfather she had barely known but understood now with painful clarity. Samuel had given her more than gold or property. He had given her a story worth telling, a fight worth finishing, and a legacy that demanded not just protection but transformation. The boat would sail again, carrying not fish but history, not profit but purpose. The waterfront property would become something that served the community Samuel had loved even as he isolated himself from it. And the truth about the Belmont would ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, touching lives and closing wounds across decades of silence. That was inheritance, Claire realized. Not what you received, but what you chose to do with it. Not the weight of the past, but the possibility of the future. And standing there in darkness broken only by dock lights and the eternal presence of the sea, she understood finally why Samuel had lived the way he did, hiding and protecting and preparing for a moment he would never see but trusted would eventually arrive. The moment had arrived. And Claire Bennett, homeless single mother turned guardian of maritime secrets, was ready to meet it with all the stubborn courage her grandfather had known she possessed. The sea stretched dark before her, holding its dead and its treasures in equal silence, and the Mariana's ghost rocked gently at her mooring, patient as she had always been, waiting for the next voyage to begin. The federal courthouse in Boston smelled of polished wood and institutional disinfectant, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of people whose lives hung in balance between what they had done and what the law would allow them to keep. Claire sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 6, Emma coloring quietly beside her, while their attorney reviewed documents one final time before the hearing that would determine everything. It had been 8 months since that night on the Mariana's ghost. 8 months of lawyers and depositions and federal agents treating Claire's small life like evidence in a case that stretched back to before she was born. The gold had been seized immediately, of course, locked away in some government facility where it would likely remain forever, caught in bureaucratic limbo between Treasury claims and salvage law precedent. But the documents, those precious papers Claire had hidden in Vincent's office before the agents could catalog them, those had changed everything. The attorney they had found, or rather who had found them, was named Elizabeth Chen, a maritime law specialist from Providence who had spent 20 years fighting federal overreach in salvage cases. She had taken one look at Samuel's documentation and the government's cover-up memorandum and agreed to represent Claire pro bono, seeing in the case something larger than money or property rights. "They're going to offer a settlement," Chen said now, settling onto the bench beside Claire with the weariness of someone who had spent too many hours in courtrooms just like this one. "I've been negotiating with the U.S. attorney all week. They want this to go away quietly, without a trial that would expose exactly what was on the Belmont and why it was covered up for 80 years. Claire looked up from watching Emma draw elaborate pictures of boats and fish. "What kind of settlement?" "Full immunity for you and Samuel's estate. No criminal charges, no civil penalties. In exchange, you surrender all claim to the salvaged materials and agree to confidentiality regarding the classified documents." Chen paused, weighing her next words carefully. "But here's where it gets interesting. They're also offering $2 million as compensation for Samuel's cooperation in documenting the wreck site, retroactively classifying his salvage work as contracted archaeological survey rather than theft." The number should have felt enormous, life-changing. And it was, objectively. $2 million would secure Emma's future, pay for college and a real home and all the stability Claire had never been able to provide. But it tasted like ash in her mouth, like accepting payment for Samuel's silence when his whole life had been consumed by the weight of truths he couldn't tell. "What about the families?" Claire asked. "The crew of the Belmont, the people who never got answers about what happened to their sons and husbands and fathers. Does the settlement include acknowledging what was really on that ship, or do they keep lying for another 80 years? Chen smiled, and it was the first genuine warmth Claire had seen from the attorney in months of cold legal strategy. "That's where the documents you saved become leverage. I told the U.S. attorney that if they want confidentiality, it comes with conditions. Full disclosure to the Belmont families about the ship's actual cargo and mission. A formal memorial service with military honors for the crew. And most importantly, declassification of enough details that historians can finally write the true story of what happened, even if certain specifics remain sealed." Emma tugged at Claire's sleeve. "Mom, is this about Grandpa Samuel?" "Yes, sweetheart," Claire answered, pulling her daughter close. "We're making sure people remember him the right way, and that he didn't keep those secrets for nothing." The hearing itself was brief and procedural, a federal judge reviewing the settlement terms and asking Claire if she understood what she was agreeing to. She said yes because it was true, she understood perfectly. Samuel had taken something that didn't belong to him, but he had also preserved truth that powerful people wanted buried. The settlement acknowledged both realities, finding some middle ground between law and justice that would never satisfy everyone but might allow a kind of peace. Outside the courthouse, spring sunlight warmed the Boston streets, turning the Charles River gold in the late afternoon. Chen shook Claire's hand formally, then surprised her with a brief hug. "Your grandfather was right to trust you with this. Not everyone would have fought to make sure the truth mattered more than the money." "The money matters too," Claire admitted, thinking of the relief of not having to worry about rent or food or whether Emma's worn sneakers would last another month. "I'm not noble enough to pretend it doesn't. But I needed to know it meant something, that Samuel's whole life wasn't just about hiding gold in a bilge." Chen nodded understanding. "The memorial service is scheduled for June 14th at the Gloucester Maritime Museum. The Navy is sending an honor guard. 3 surviving family members of Belmont crew have confirmed they'll attend. Your grandfather's name will be included in the program as the man whose documentation finally brought their loved one's story to light." She paused. "That's legacy, Ms. Bennett. That's what Samuel was really protecting all those years." The Mariana's ghost had been returned to Claire once the federal investigation concluded, though the agents had torn through her so thoroughly that restoration would take months and money Claire wasn't sure she wanted to spend. Some wounds, she thought, maybe should stay visible, reminders of what had been lost and found and paid for in ways that couldn't be calculated in dollars. But Vincent Reyes had other ideas. When Claire returned to Gloucester with the settlement money secure in accounts that still felt surreal, she found the old harbor master had organized half the marina into a volunteer restoration crew. Fishermen who had worked alongside Samuel decades ago, younger boat owners who had heard the stories and wanted to honor the legend. They had already stripped the damaged interior, sanded the hull, and begun the painstaking work of bringing the vessel back to life. "She deserves better than to rot at dock," Vincent said simply when Claire tried to thank him. "Samuel loved this boat before he loved anything else, maybe even before he loved Margaret, though don't tell her ghost I said so. It's fitting she gets to see the water again, gets to remember what she was built for." Claire walked the length of the Mariana's ghost in her work slip, running her hand along the newly treated wood, feeling the grain beneath her palm like braille telling stories she was only beginning to learn to read. Emma raced ahead, delighted by the organized chaos of the restoration, asking questions of patient volunteers who treated her like the boat's rightful heir. "Will she fish again?" Emma asked, watching a man repair the winch mechanism with careful attention. "Maybe," Claire answered, though she wasn't sure what form that fishing would take. The commercial license Samuel had maintained was still valid, but Claire had no experience running a trawler and less desire to learn the brutal economics of an industry that had broken so many families. Still, there were other possibilities beginning to take shape in her mind, influenced by conversations with Vincent and the museum director planning the Belmont Memorial. The waterfront property Samuel had left her sat 3 blocks from the marina, a small building with good bones and a view of the harbor that tourists would pay premium prices to enjoy. Claire had walked past it a dozen times before finally working up courage to go inside, finding rooms empty except for dust and memory. But standing in those vacant spaces, she could imagine something taking shape. Not a restaurant or boutique, nothing that would erase the working character of the neighborhood. Instead, a maritime heritage center, a place where the stories of boats and fishermen and the sea's endless capacity for both generosity and cruelty could be preserved and shared. The Mariana's ghost could be part of that story, offering educational tours or serving as a floating classroom for children learning about Gloucester's fishing history. Samuel's journals and the non-classified portions of his documentation could form the core of an exhibit about salvage archaeology and the ethical questions it raised. And the Belmont, finally acknowledged and memorialized, could remind visitors that the sea held secrets worth more than gold, truths that demanded to be honored even at great personal cost. "You're thinking about something big," Vincent observed, joining her on the dock as evening painted the harbor in shades of amber and rose. "I can see it in your face," same expression Samuel used to get when he was planning something that would probably cause trouble but needed doing anyway. Claire smiled at the comparison. "I'm thinking about staying. Really staying, not just hiding out until the money runs low and we have to run back to Boston. Emma loves it here, loves the water and the boats and feeling like she belongs to something bigger than a cramped apartment and a mom who's always exhausted." She paused, watching Goldswell overhead in the fading light. "And I think maybe Samuel left me more than property or money. He left me a purpose, if I'm brave enough to claim it." The memorial service for the SS Belmont drew a crowd larger than anyone anticipated. The Gloucester Maritime Museum's small ceremony space overflowed with Navy veterans, maritime historians, distant relatives of the lost crew, and local residents who remembered when the story was fresh tragedy rather than historical footnote. The Mariana's ghost, restored enough to be seaworthy even if not fully finished, was moored at the museum's dock, her presence a silent witness to the acknowledgement taking place. Claire stood near the back with Emma, uncomfortable with attention but knowing her presence mattered. These people needed to see Samuel's granddaughter, needed physical proof that the man who had carried their secrets for 30 years had family who honored what he had done. When the Navy Honor Guard presented her with a folded flag in recognition of Samuel's service to historical preservation, Claire felt tears sting her eyes not from sadness but from a complicated pride she was only beginning to understand. The museum director, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret O'Sullivan who had known Samuel in his final years, spoke about the Belmont's crew with a reverence that transcended academic interest. She read their names one by one, 23 men whose deaths had been acknowledged but whose mission had remained classified until now. For each name, a bell rang, its tone clear and mournful across the harbor's evening water. Robert Morrison, age 22, quartermaster. Survived by wife Dorothy and infant son James. The bell rang, and somewhere in the crowd, an elderly man with Robert's eyes wept quietly for the father he had never known. When the ceremony concluded, Claire found herself approached by that man, James Morrison, now in his 80s with his father's naval bearings still evident despite age's inevitable erosion. "Thank you," he said simply, gripping Claire's hand with surprising strength. "My mother spent her whole life wondering if my father's death meant something, if he had died for a reason beyond being in the wrong place during a storm. Now I can tell her grave that yes, it mattered. The cargo he protected was important enough that the government hid it for 80 years. That's not nothing." "I'm sorry it took so long," Claire replied, inadequate words for decades of uncertainty. Morrison shook his head. "Don't be. Some truths can only be told when the right person comes along to tell them. Your grandfather was that person, and so are you." He pressed something into her hand, a photograph worn soft with handling. Robert Morrison in his dress uniform, young and confident beside Dorothy in her wedding dress. "For your museum, when you build it. So people remember they weren't just names in a manifest, they were real men with real people who loved them." The autumn that followed was consumed by transformation. The waterfront building became a construction site, carefully renovated to preserve its historic character while adding modern accessibility and climate control for sensitive exhibits. Claire worked alongside contractors and volunteers, learning building codes and grant applications and all the tedious details of turning vision into reality. Emma started school in Gloucester, making friends with children whose families had fished these waters for generations, becoming part of a community in ways Claire had never experienced in Boston's transient neighborhoods. Vincent Reyes proved invaluable, not just for his maritime knowledge but for his network of connections throughout Gloucester's overlapping worlds of fishing, tourism, and historical preservation. He introduced Claire to boat owners willing to donate artifacts, to retired fishermen with stories worth recording, to historians who had spent careers studying New England's maritime heritage and were thrilled to see someone creating space for that knowledge to live beyond academic journals. The Gloucester Maritime Heritage Center opened on a gray April morning 18 months after that night agents had boarded the Mariana's Ghost. The weather seemed fitting somehow, neither triumphant sunshine nor dramatic storm but ordinary overcast skies under which real work happened and real lives unfolded. Claire stood at the entrance, Emma beside her holding the ceremonial ribbon they would cut, and looked at what they had built. Inside, carefully curated exhibits told stories of fishing families and boat builders, of storms survived and ships lost, of the delicate balance between making a living from the sea and being claimed by it. Samuel's journals occupied a place of honor, his precise handwriting offering glimpses into a fisherman's daily life and the slow accumulation of knowledge that had led him to the Belmont. The salvaged items from the wreck, those the federal government had agreed to loan for display, rested in climate-controlled cases alongside photographs of the crew and excerpts from letters home. But the centerpiece, the exhibit that drew visitors back repeatedly, was the Mariana's Ghost herself. Fully restored and moored at the center's dock, she served as both museum piece and working vessel, taking students and tourists out on educational cruises that taught maritime history through direct experience of wind and wave. Emma had insisted they keep Samuel's wheelhouse largely as he had left it, his jacket still on its hook, his coffee mug on the chart table, small details that made the boat feel less like a sterile exhibit and more like a place where someone's life had been genuinely lived. On quiet mornings before the center opened, Claire would sometimes sit in that wheelhouse alone, running her fingers over charts her grandfather had marked, trying to understand the man she had known so poorly. The silence he had carried, she realized now, hadn't been emptiness but profound weight, the accumulated pressure of truths too dangerous to speak. He had lived a small life by necessity, denying himself comfort and connection, so that someday Emma could have the freedom he had sacrificed. That was legacy, Claire thought. Not gold or property or even truth in abstract, but the deliberate choices made by one generation to give the next better ground to stand on. Samuel had given her that ground, even if reaching it required walking through federal investigations and the exposure of secrets that had shaped his entire adult life. Vincent found her there one morning, 2 years after the center's opening, with news that couldn't wait for office hours. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, settling into the navigator's chair with a groan of aging joints. The federal salvage case was finally closed yesterday. The Justice Department issued its final report confirming the Belmont carried classified cargo, acknowledging Samuel's documentation was vital to historical record, and recommending new protocols for dealing with maritime archaeological discoveries of potential national security significance. They named the protocols after him, Vincent added with quiet satisfaction. The Bennett Standards for Maritime Historical Preservation. Figured he'd get a kick out of that, having his name attached to the bureaucracy he spent 30 years hiding from. Claire smiled, imagining Samuel's reaction, the dry humor that had occasionally broken through his habitual reticence. He would have hated it and been secretly pleased all at once. That's about right, Vincent agreed. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the harbor wake around them, boats departing for their day's work while others returned with catches to be weighed and sold. The rhythm Samuel had known his entire life, continuing because that was what the sea demanded, perpetual motion and adaptation, and the stubborn persistence of those who made their living from its uncertain generosity. Emma appeared at the wheelhouse door, breathless from running. "Mom, there's a whole class of 4th graders here for the tour, and they want to hear about the treasure hunt and the federal agents and everything. Can I help tell the story?" Claire looked at her daughter, now 10 and confident in ways Claire had never managed at that age, comfortable in her own skin and her place in this community. Emma knew the story of the Mariana's ghost and the Belmont not as burden but as heritage, something to be proud of and shared. That transformation alone justified every difficult choice of the past 2 years. "You can help," Claire agreed. "But remember, it's not really about treasure or adventure. It's about a man who chose to protect the truth even when it cost him everything, because he believed someday it would matter." Emma nodded solemnly, already moving toward the dock where excited children waited. Claire followed more slowly, Vincent beside her, both of them understanding without speaking that some stories took generations to complete, that Samuel's choices had created possibilities he never lived to see but would ripple forward through time in ways impossible to fully measure. The harbor stretched before them, constant and changing, holding secrets in its depths and offering its surface to those brave or foolish enough to test themselves against its moods. Somewhere beneath those waters, the SS Belmont rested in darkness, her crew finally honored and her cargo's truth finally told. And here on the dock, in spring sunshine warming old wood, a fishing boat bore witness to the fact that some inheritances couldn't be measured in gold or property, only in the courage to receive them and the wisdom to understand what they truly meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.